Every story has a beginning, a mystery waiting to be unraveled, a truth lurking in the shadows. Here at Charlie's Tales, I bring you the strangest, the darkest, and the most unbelievable stories from around the world. Some are terrifying, some are tragic, but all of them will leave you thinking. So sit back, listen closely, and let's dive into today's tale. On the morning of May 18, 1980, 30-year-old Bruce Fladwood awoke to the gentle sounds of birds chirping outside his cabin. Located just 11 miles from the summit of Mount St. Helens in Washington state, the small wooden structure had been his weekend retreat for the past 3 years. As he sipped his morning coffee on the porch, he admired the magnificent volcano that dominated the landscape, its once perfect cone now distorted by months of ominous bulging. Scientists had been monitoring the mountain since March, when a series of small earthquakes had signaled that the long-dormant volcano was awakening. By April, a massive bulge had formed on the north face of the mountain, growing at a rate of 5 feet per day. Authorities had established a restricted red zone around the volcano, evacuating most residents and tourists from the area. But Bruce, like a handful of others, had refused to leave. His cabin was outside the official red zone, if barely, and he'd grown skeptical of the repeated warnings. After all, for nearly 2 months, the mountain had grumbled and steamed without major incident. Local legend Harry Truman, an 83-year-old who owned a lodge at Spirit Lake, had famously declared he would stay put no matter what happened, and many locals admired his stubbornness. Bruce, though less vocal about his decision, shared the sentiment. "I've lived in the shadow of this mountain my whole life," Bruce said. "She's not going to hurt me." It was a miscalculation that would nearly cost him his life. At precisely 8:32 a.m., as Bruce was washing his breakfast dishes, the north face of Mount St. Helens collapsed in what would become the largest landslide in recorded history. The sudden removal of this portion of the mountain immediately released pressure on the magma chamber beneath, triggering a lateral blast that exploded outward at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Bruce's first indication that something was wrong came not as a sound, but as a strange sensation, a sudden change in air pressure that made his ears pop painfully. Stepping outside, he looked up to see the mountain's entire north face disintegrating before his eyes. Bruce VO. It didn't seem real, Bruce VO. It was like watching a special effect in a movie. The entire mountainside just fell away. The initial blast sent a cloud of superheated gas, rock, and ash straight toward Bruce's location. In the fraction of a second he had to react, Bruce made a decision that would ultimately save his life. He dove into the root cellar beneath his cabin. The sturdy underground storage space, reinforced with concrete walls and a heavy wooden door, had been built by the previous owner as a place to store vegetables through the winter. Bruce had rarely used it, keeping only a few canned goods and emergency supplies there. As he pulled the door shut above him, he had no way of knowing that this neglected space would become his sanctuary for the next 56 hours. The first blast hit his cabin with apocalyptic force. Bruce described the sound as 1,000 freight trains colliding with 1,000 claps of thunder. The ground shook so violently that he was thrown against the wall, fracturing 2 ribs. The temperature outside soared to hundreds of degrees as the pyroclastic flow, a current of superheated gas and rock, engulfed everything in its path. Above him, Bruce's cabin was obliterated almost instantly. The wooden structure was first flattened by the force of the blast, then incinerated by the heat. Had he remained inside, he would have been killed instantly, like 57 others who perished that day. Inside the root cellar, Bruce found himself in total darkness. The impact had knocked out the single light bulb, and the small window had been covered by debris. The temperature rose rapidly as the pyroclastic flow passed overhead, turning the cellar into an oven. Bruce soaked his shirt in water from a jug he kept stored and covered his face with it, breathing through the damp fabric to protect his lungs from the scorching air. For 6 terrifying hours, the mountain continued to erupt. The initial lateral blast was followed by additional pyroclastic flows, mud flows, and ash columns that rose 15 miles into the atmosphere. Bruce lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of his world being destroyed above him, uncertain if he would survive. By late afternoon, the temperature in the cellar had become almost unbearable. Bruce was experiencing symptoms of heat exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, and confusion. He had only 1 gallon of water, which was rapidly depleting as he tried to keep himself cool and hydrated. The air was thick with ash that had filtered through every crack and crevice, making breathing increasingly difficult. I kept thinking about my parents, Bruce thought. They had begged me to leave when the warnings first came. I remembered promising them I'd be fine, that it was all overblown. Now I was sure I would die without ever getting to apologize for being so stubborn. As night fell, the temperature finally began to drop. The main eruption had subsided, though occasional tremors still shook the ground. Bruce tried to open the cellar door but found it pinned by heavy debris. He was trapped. In the darkness, he took inventory of his supplies: half a gallon of water, 4 cans of beans, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight with failing batteries. If help didn't come, he would need to ration these carefully. The next morning, though Bruce could only guess at the time in his windowless shelter, the full scale of the disaster was becoming apparent to the outside world. Mount St. Helens had undergone a cataclysmic eruption that had changed the landscape forever. The mountain was now 1,400 feet shorter, with a gaping crater where its summit had once been. 230 square miles of forest had been flattened instantly, with trees laid out like matchsticks, all pointing away from the blast. Spirit Lake, once a pristine blue jewel at the mountain's base, had been filled with debris and mud, its depth reduced by over 200 feet. The water temperature had risen to near boiling. Harry Truman, who had refused to leave his lodge, was buried under hundreds of feet of volcanic debris, his body never to be recovered. Search and rescue operations began immediately, but they were hampered by the devastation. Roads had been obliterated, bridges washed away by mud flows, and the entire region was covered in a thick layer of ash that made air searches nearly impossible. Most rescue efforts focused on the periphery of the disaster zone, where survivors were more likely to be found. Bruce's location, just 11 miles from the summit, was considered unsurvivable. The search teams operating in the area were looking for bodies, not survivors. Inside his underground prison, Bruce was facing a grim reality. The air was becoming increasingly toxic as carbon dioxide built up in the confined space. His water supply was dangerously low, and he was developing a severe cough from the ash he had inhaled. Worse still, he could hear the unsettling sound of mud and debris shifting above him, threatening to breach the cellar's concrete walls. On the second night, Bruce made a desperate attempt to dig his way out. Using a garden trowel that had been stored in the cellar, he began to chip away at the debris blocking the door. After several hours of exhausting work, he had cleared only a small opening, barely enough to let in a shaft of dim light and a breath of fresh air. What Bruce saw through this opening was beyond comprehension. The familiar landscape had been transformed into an alien world. Where lush forest had once stood, there was now only a gray wasteland of ash and shattered trees. The air was thick with suspended particles that reduced visibility to a few feet. And most disturbingly, the ground appeared to be moving, flowing like a river of mud and debris. Realizing that escaping might be more dangerous than remaining in the cellar, Bruce sealed the opening as best he could and retreated to the relative safety of his underground shelter. He was now rationing his water by the spoonful, wetting his lips and tongue just enough to keep from complete dehydration. By the third day, Bruce was slipping in and out of consciousness. His injuries, combined with dehydration and oxygen deprivation, were taking their toll. In his more lucid moments, he recorded brief messages to his family on a small notepad, assuming these would be his final communications. Bruce, VO. I don't regret staying. Bruce, VO. I've always loved this mountain. If it's my time to go, at least I'm going in a place that matters to me. It was on this third day, as Bruce was resigned to his fate, that salvation came in an unexpected form. A team of geologists, authorized to enter the restricted zone to take measurements, had detected an anomaly in their readings near the site of Bruce's former cabin. Curious about the disturbance, they diverted from their planned route to investigate. What they found was the remains of Bruce's root cellar, the concrete walls partially collapsed, but still intact beneath a layer of volcanic debris. One of the scientists, Dr. Catherine Weston, later described hearing a faint tapping sound coming from beneath the rubble. Dr. Weston, VO. At first, we thought it was just the settling of debris or perhaps water dripping. Dr. Weston, VO. But there was a rhythm to it that seemed deliberate. When we realized what it might be, we started digging immediately. Using the limited tools they had brought for their geological survey, the team began to clear the debris covering the cellar door. It was slow, dangerous work, complicated by the unstable ground and the toxic gases still seeping from the volcano. After 2 hours of digging, they managed to create an opening large enough to peer inside. Shining a flashlight into the darkness, they were shocked to see Bruce, emaciated, covered in ash, but still alive, staring back at them. Bruce, VO. When I saw that light, I thought I was hallucinating. Then I heard voices calling my name and I knew it was real. I think I started crying, but I was so dehydrated that no tears would come. Extracting Bruce from the cellar was a complex operation. He was too weak to climb out on his own, and the opening was too small for rescuers to enter and assist him. Eventually, they managed to lower a harness, and with Bruce's limited cooperation, secure it around his chest. With agonizing slowness, they pulled him through the narrow opening and into the ashen daylight. Bruce's condition was critical. He had lost nearly 20 pounds in just 3 days, was severely dehydrated, and had chemical burns on his lungs from breathing the toxic air. The rescue team administered emergency first aid, providing oxygen and intravenous fluids before evacuating him by helicopter to a hospital in Portland. Against all odds, Bruce Fladwood had survived one of the most devastating volcanic eruptions in American history. His survival was deemed miraculous by medical professionals, who noted that he had been less than 24 hours from death when rescued. Dr. Chen, VO. By all rights, he should have died in the initial blast. Dr. Chen, VO. The root cellar saved him from the immediate explosion, but the air quality inside should have been lethal after just a day. He survived on a knife's edge. Bruce's recovery was slow and difficult. The damage to his lungs would affect him for the rest of his life, leaving him with chronic respiratory issues. The psychological trauma was equally severe. He suffered from nightmares, PTSD, and survivor's guilt, particularly when he learned how many others had perished in the eruption. Scene 17, Press Conference. But recover he did. 6 months after the eruption, Bruce held a press conference from his hospital room, where he publicly thanked his rescuers and offered condolences to the families of those who didn't survive. When asked if he regretted his decision to stay near the mountain despite the warnings, his answer was complex. Bruce, VO. I regret my arrogance. I thought I knew better than the scientists, than the authorities. I didn't respect the mountain. That was a mistake I nearly paid for with my life. But I don't regret where I was. That mountain was my home. I just wish I'd found a better way to honor it. In the years following his rescue, Bruce became an advocate for volcano safety and disaster preparedness. He worked with the U.S. Geological Survey to develop better early warning systems and evacuation protocols for volcanic regions. His testimony before Congress helped secure funding for the Cascades Volcano Observatory, which monitors volcanic activity throughout the Pacific Northwest. Today, more than 4 decades after the eruption, Mount St. Helens is a place of both destruction and rebirth. The blast zone, once a lifeless wasteland, has gradually been reclaimed by nature. Plants have taken root in the ash, animals have returned to the forests, and the mountain itself has begun to rebuild its shattered peak. Bruce Fladwood, now in his 70s, still visits the mountain regularly. He has watched its slow healing process with a sense of kinship, seeing in its recovery a reflection of his own journey. Bruce, VO. The mountain and I, we both survived something that should have killed us, Bruce, V. We both came out changed, scarred, but we're still here. There's a lesson in that, I think. Nature has its own timeline for healing, so do people. His story remains one of the most remarkable survival tales in the annals of natural disasters, a testament to human resilience and the sometimes random nature of who lives and who dies when the Earth unleashes its full power. Bruce Fladwood didn't just survive Mount St. Helens. He emerged from its ashes with a newfound respect for the forces that shape our world, and a mission to ensure that others would never underestimate them again.